The night was dark and moonless, the air thick with dampness and silence, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Emma couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept returning to the geese, to their illness, and she could hear their weak, tortured sounds coming from the dark barn. Suddenly, from behind the wall, there was a strange scraping sound, as if something or someone was dragging heavily across the wood. Emma jolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest, and the air around her seemed to grow thicker and colder. She stood up, quietly moving to the window, peering into the darkness. Shadows moved among the trees, as if someone was hiding there. At that moment, a wave of terror washed over her. Someone was out there, but there were no footsteps, no signs of presence. And then she saw them, eyes gleaming, like something out of a nightmare. There were many of them, and they were staring straight at her with cold, foreign gazes. Chapter 1. A quiet farm life and troubling signs. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of damp earth mixed with the sweetness of fresh hay. The golden light of dawn stretched lazily across the farm, illuminating the dewdrops clinging to the wooden fence posts. Birds chirped from the nearby trees, their melodies blending with the soft honking of geese awakening in their enclosure. John stepped outside, stretching his arms as he took a deep breath. He loved this time of day, when the world was just waking up, and the only sounds were the rustling of animals stirring in their pens. He pulled on his old, worn-out boots and made his way to the barn, where the cows were already shifting impatiently, waiting for their morning feed. Inside the barn, Emma was busy tending to the rabbits, gently stroking their soft fur as she checked their water bowls. "They seem restless today," she murmured, glancing up as John entered. "Maybe it's the weather changing." John nodded absent-mindedly, his mind already on his next task. He had noticed that the tractor had been making a strange noise the previous evening, and he wanted to check on it before the day's work began. As he stepped outside and walked toward the old machine, he ran his fingers along its faded green body. The engine rumbled to life when he turned the key, but there was an odd, uneven hum beneath the usual purr. "Sounds like trouble," he muttered to himself, kneeling down to inspect the engine. He wasn't a mechanic, but he had spent enough years on this farm to know when something wasn't right. He decided to let it run for a bit, hoping it would smooth out, and turned his attention back to the geese. Emma had already made her way to the enclosure, a bucket of feed in her hands. As she scattered the grains across the ground, she noticed that some of the geese were moving sluggishly, their usually bright eyes looking dull. She frowned, stepping closer. "John, come here a moment." He wiped his hands on his overalls and joined her, following her gaze. A few of the birds stood still, barely reacting as others pecked at the food. One of them, a large white gander, was sitting apart from the rest, its head drooping slightly. "They're not acting right," Emma said, her voice edged with concern. "Could be the cold. Or maybe they ate something bad." John crouched down, watching the gander closely. "We'll keep an eye on them," he said, though a nagging feeling settled in his stomach. These birds were hardy, not the type to suddenly fall ill. He made a mental note to check their water source later, just in case. The day passed with the usual routine: milking the cows, tending to the vegetable garden, repairing a section of the fence that had started to lean after last week's storm. Emma busied herself in the kitchen, baking a fresh loaf of bread while keeping an eye on the geese through the window. Every so often, she would glance up, hoping to see them moving more energetically, but the sluggishness remained. As evening approached, the sky turned a soft shade of orange, casting long shadows across the farm. John finished his chores and made one last trip to the barn, checking on the cows before heading inside. Emma was already setting the table for dinner, her expression thoughtful. "I'm still worried about the geese," she admitted as they ate. "Something feels wrong." John sighed, setting down his fork. "If they don't improve by tomorrow, we'll call the vet. Maybe it's just a passing thing." Emma nodded, but the uneasy feeling in her chest didn't fade. Later that night, as they settled into bed, she lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the farm outside. The wind whispered against the windows, and the distant hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. Then, just as she was drifting into sleep, she heard it, a strange, low rustling sound, coming from the direction of the goose enclosure. She sat up, her heart pounding. "John," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "Something's outside." John groaned, still half asleep. "It's probably just the wind," he mumbled. But Emma wasn't convinced. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, pulling on her robe. The rustling came again, followed by a faint, eerie thumping noise. She glanced toward the window, but the night was too dark to see anything clearly. John sighed, pushing back the blankets. All right," he muttered, reaching for his boots. "Let's have a look." As they stepped outside, the cold night air bit at their skin. The farm, usually so peaceful under the moonlight, felt strangely tense. Emma clutched John's arm as they approached the goose enclosure, the wooden gate creaking softly as he pushed it open. Inside, the geese huddled together, their usual chatter reduced to nervous whispers. Something had disturbed them. John lifted the lantern higher, its flickering light casting long shadows. And then they saw it. Near the far end of the enclosure, one of the geese lay motionless on the ground. Its wings were spread slightly, its body limp. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. John knelt beside the bird, his face grim. "This isn't right," he said quietly. "Something's going on." The wind picked up, rustling the trees beyond the fence. Emma shivered, not just from the cold, but from a deep, growing fear. Something was very wrong on the farm, and this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Mysterious Illness. The morning sun had barely risen when John and Emma stepped outside, their breath visible in the crisp air. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on them. The dead goose had been carefully removed, but neither of them could shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Emma hurried toward the enclosure, heart pounding in her chest. The remaining geese were clustered together, shifting restlessly. Their usual morning honks were subdued, as if an uneasy silence had settled over them. Then she saw it. 2 more geese were lying near the fence, their heads drooping, bodies still. "John!" Her voice broke the quiet morning air. He was by her side in an instant, his face hardening as he took in the sight. One of the birds gave a weak, pitiful honk before slumping further onto the ground. The other barely reacted as Emma knelt beside them, reaching out to touch their feathers. They weren't cold yet, but they weren't responding to her voice the way they should. "This is getting worse," John muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "We need a vet." Emma nodded, already wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll call him now." The local veterinarian, Dr. Fisher, was a middle-aged man with years of experience tending to farm animals. When he arrived an hour later, he took one look at the sick birds and frowned. He knelt beside them, gently pressing his fingers to their wings, lifting their beaks, inspecting their eyes. "Strange," he murmured, pulling out a small flashlight to get a better look. "Their breathing is shallow and they seem weak, but there's no obvious sign of infection. No swelling, no discharge, no wounds." John shifted uncomfortably. "What do you think it is?" Dr. Fisher shook his head. "Hard to say without tests. I'll take some blood samples, but I don't expect much. This doesn't look like anything I've seen before." Emma's stomach twisted. She had hoped for an easy answer, something treatable. Instead, she was left with more uncertainty. The geese, as if sensing the tension, suddenly grew restless. A few of them started flapping their wings, honking anxiously. The entire flock shifted toward the corner of the enclosure, pushing against the fence as if trying to get away from something unseen. John frowned. "What's gotten into them?" Dr. Fisher stood up, dusting off his hands. "Animals react to illness in strange ways. Sometimes they sense things before we do." He turned to Emma. "Have you noticed any predators around? Foxes, maybe?" Emma shook her head. "Not that I've seen. But—" She hesitated. "Last night I heard something. Rustling. It was strange." John glanced at her. "You didn't mention that." She sighed. I didn't know if it was important. But now, with the geese acting like this, Dr. Fisher frowned but said nothing, scribbling notes onto a small pad. I'll get these tests run as soon as I can. In the meantime, separate the sick birds from the rest. If this is contagious, we don't want it spreading. John nodded, already moving toward the enclosure to start building a temporary pen. Emma lingered for a moment, watching as the vet packed up his things. Dr. Fisher, she said quietly, if it is something serious, will they survive? He met her gaze, hesitating for just a second too long. Let's hope for the best, he said at last. But I won't lie to you. If we don't figure out what this is soon, you might lose more of them. Emma felt her throat tighten. She watched as he drove away, leaving behind only the promise of results that might not come in time. The rest of the day passed in a blur of chores and worry. John worked on fixing up the separate enclosure while Emma prepared warm mash for the sick birds, hoping that even if medicine couldn't help them yet, a little comfort might. By the afternoon, the healthy geese were still acting strangely. They refused to go near the spot where their fallen companions had been. Some of them kept stretching their necks toward the woods beyond the farm, honking in short, nervous bursts. They know something we don't, John muttered, watching them with narrowed eyes. Emma shivered. She had been around animals long enough to trust their instincts. And right now, every instinct told her that something was very, very wrong. As evening fell, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flickering candlelight. The house was warm, filled with the comforting scent of freshly baked bread. But the unease wouldn't leave her. Then, suddenly, she remembered something. Her grandmother's stories. The old remedies passed down through generations. There had been something about birds, something about an illness that had struck their farm long ago. She closed her eyes, trying to recall the details. A tea made from herbs, a special mixture added to their drinking water. She stood abruptly, hurrying toward the bookshelf where she kept her grandmother's old notebooks. Flipping through the yellowed pages, she searched desperately for anything that might help. And then she found it, a detailed recipe written in neat, looping handwriting. A mixture of dried chamomile, apple cider vinegar, and crushed garlic, meant to boost the immune system of sick birds. Her hands trembled as she traced the words. Could it work? Was this their chance? John walked in just as she looked up, determination in her eyes. I think I know how to help them, she said. He raised an eyebrow. You found something? She held up the notebook. Grandmother's remedy. It might be worth trying. John hesitated, then nodded slowly. If the vet doesn't have answers, then we have to do what we can. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The geese honked in the distance, a sound filled with unease. As Emma started gathering the ingredients, a single thought echoed in her mind. They had to act fast, because if Dr. Fisher was right, and this illness was deadly, time was running out. Chapter 3. Fighting for the birds' lives and the first loss. John had never been one to rely on old remedies, but as he stood over the bubbling pot in the kitchen, he realized they had no other choice. The vet had left without answers. The test results wouldn't come soon, and the geese were getting worse. The scent of chamomile and garlic filled the room, blending with the earthy tang of vinegar. Emma sat at the table, carefully measuring out crushed herbs, her hands steady despite the worry etched into her face. This has to work, she murmured. John stirred the mixture one last time before pouring it into a bucket. It will, he said, more to convince himself than her. Together, they carried the warm remedy to the enclosure, where the geese lay slumped against one another, their wings limp. A few stirred weakly as Emma approached, dipping a soft cloth into the herbal infusion and gently rubbing it along their beaks. Come on, darlings, she whispered. Just a little sip. Some of the birds accepted the treatment without protest, their dull eyes fluttering as the warm liquid touched their tongues. Others barely reacted. John knelt beside her, carefully tilting a shallow bowl of the mixture toward one of the weaker geese. Took a hesitant sip, its beak trembling. For a moment, hope flickered in John's chest. Maybe this would be enough. Maybe. A sharp, choking gasp broke the silence. Emma turned just in time to see one of the geese convulse violently. Its body tensed, wings spasming before it slumped to the ground. No, no, no! Emma reached for it, but it was already too late. The bird was still. John clenched his fists, staring at the lifeless body. A weight pressed against his chest, heavy and suffocating. He had seen animals die before. He had buried sick piglets, lost old horses to time. But this was different. Felt like failure. Emma placed a trembling hand on his arm. "We did what we could," she whispered. "But was it enough?" As they buried the bird near the edge of the farm, the other geese watched silently. The air was thick with grief, but there was no time to mourn. When they returned to the enclosure, John saw it immediately. More birds were losing their strength. Some struggled to stand, their legs wobbling beneath them. Others simply lay still, their breathing shallow. The illness was spreading. John wiped sweat from his forehead, frustration gnawing at his patience. "We need to do more," he muttered. "Maybe increase the dose. Maybe." A sudden commotion cut him off. One of the geese, a large white gander that had shown signs of recovery, was moving aggressively toward a smaller, weaker bird. Its feathers fluffed out, its sharp beak snapping as it lunged forward. Emma gasped, "John, stop it!" But before either of them could react, the gander struck. The smaller goose let out a weak, pitiful cry as it stumbled backward. The larger bird flapped its wings, its eyes dark with something unrecognizable. Fear, confusion, desperation. John rushed forward, stepping between them. "Enough!" he barked, his voice firm. The gander hesitated, its breathing heavy, before retreating slightly. But its gaze remained locked onto the weaker bird. Emma exhaled shakily. Why would it do that? John shook his head. Animals turn on each other when they're scared. Maybe it senses weakness. Emma knelt beside the injured goose, her hands gentle as she checked for wounds. "We can't let this happen again," she said softly. "We need to separate the weak ones." John nodded grimly. "We'll build another pen. Tonight." The night air was cold as they worked, hammering wooden planks into place by lantern light. The farm was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Emma could still hear the geese shifting uneasily in their enclosure, their usual chatter replaced by silence. As they finished securing the last plank, John glanced toward the dark horizon. Something felt wrong, not just with the geese but with the entire farm. A sickness with no name, predator that couldn't be seen, and a growing fear that this was far from over. Chapter 4. An unexpected discovery and a new danger. John sat on the porch, staring at the quiet farm before him. The events of the past few days had drained him, but his mind refused to rest. He turned a small notebook in his calloused hands, filled with observations he had scribbled down since the first goose fell ill. Weakness, loss of appetite, shallow breathing, tremors. But there was something else, something he hadn't noticed until now. The birds that had shown early signs of recovery were acting strangely. The gander's sudden aggression yesterday wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something instinctual. John frowned. He had seen this before. Not recently, but long ago when he was a boy working on his father's farm. A sickness had swept through their geese back then, too, leaving only a few survivors. His father had struggled to understand what caused it, blaming everything from bad feed to tainted water. John's breath caught in his throat as a buried memory surfaced. It wasn't the food. It wasn't the water. It was the soil. He jumped up, nearly knocking over his chair. "Emma!" he called. She appeared at the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it?" He paced, his mind racing. "I think I know what's happening. This isn't some random illness. I've seen it before, on my father's farm, decades ago." Emma frowned. "You never mentioned that." "I forgot," he admitted. "I was just a boy, but I remember now. The geese got sick just like ours. Weak, confused, some turned violent. My father never figured it out, but after the birds died, he did something unusual." Emma's expression darkened. "What?" He dug up the old feeding area and found mold growing beneath the soil. It was something toxic, something that had seeped into the ground from rotting grain left too long in the damp. Emma's eyes widened. "You think that's what's happening here?" John nodded. "It makes sense. The rain last month could have disturbed something buried in the ground, releasing spores. The geese eat from the ground more than any of our other animals. If the soil's contaminated," Emma shuddered, "then we need to stop them from eating anything outside." John was already moving. "I'll start clearing a section of fresh ground, somewhere safe. We can move the birds there and keep them off the old soil." As they hurried back toward the enclosure, a familiar truck rumbled up the dirt road. Dr. Fisher stepped out, his expression grim. He held a clipboard in one hand, glancing down at his notes before speaking. "The test results came back," he said. John and Emma exchanged a glance. "And?" John asked. Dr. Fisher hesitated. "The results were inconclusive. No bacterial or viral infections detected, which means if this is something environmental, it won't show up in normal tests." Emma's jaw tightened. "Then what do we do?" The vet sighed. "I won't sugarcoat it. The birds are suffering. If we can't identify the cause soon, the humane thing might be to..." He hesitated. "Put them down." A cold silence fell between them. Emma was the first to break it. No, her voice was firm. "We're not giving up. Not yet." Dr. Fisher gave her a long look, then nodded slowly. "All right, but if they get worse..." "They won't," John interrupted. "We have an idea of what's happening. We just need time." The vet didn't argue. He simply handed John the clipboard. "Keep me updated," he said before driving away. John turned to Emma. "We move the geese tonight." She nodded. There was no time to waste. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John set to work preparing a new area for the birds while Emma gathered fresh bedding and water. The farm was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the soft clucking of the chickens settling in for the night. But something felt off. John had just finished hammering the last section of fencing when he noticed something unusual near the chicken coop. At first, he thought it was just shadows playing tricks on him. But as he stepped closer, a chill ran down his spine. Footprints. Not his, not Emma's. Something or someone had been walking around the coop. And whatever it was, it had claws. Chapter 5. The tractor breaks down at the worst possible moment. The morning was heavy with mist, curling over the fields like a thick, restless ghost. John tightened his coat against the damp chill as he climbed into the old tractor, his mind already racing through the day's tasks. The geese were still weak, but some showed signs of improvement. Emma had been up late treating them, whispering soft reassurances as she worked. John knew she wouldn't give up, and neither would he. But they needed more supplies, herbs, clean straw, maybe even a stronger disinfectant. There was no time to waste. He turned the key. The tractor coughed, sputtered, and died. John frowned, turning it again. The same result. The old machine had given him trouble before, but never like this. "Not now," he muttered, stepping down to check under the hood. The smell of oil and damp metal filled his nose as he examined the engine. Everything seemed in place. No broken belts, no obvious leaks. And yet, when he tried again, the engine barely responded. Emma's voice called from the barn. "John, you left yet?" He clenched his jaw. "Tractor won't start." A pause. Then the creak of the barn door opening. Again. "I don't know what's wrong," he admitted, frustration prickling his patience. "Could be the fuel pump. Could be the starter. Either way, I'm not getting to town anytime soon." Emma stepped closer, wiping her hands on her apron. "We still have some herbs left. Maybe enough for another day or two." John exhaled sharply, pushing back his irritation. "I'll fix it. I just need a little time." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "All right, I'll keep working on the geese in the meantime." She turned back toward the barn, but something in her posture was tense. Something was bothering her. "Emma," John called after her. She stopped but didn't turn around. "It's probably nothing," she said, voice quieter now. "But last night, I thought I heard something near the coop." John frowned. What kind of something? She shook her head. Scratching. A thump. When I went out with the lantern, I didn't see anything. But she wrapped her arms around herself. It didn't feel right. John wiped his hands on his jeans. I'll check it out after I get this thing running. Emma nodded and disappeared into the barn. He returned to the tractor, rolling up his sleeves, determined to get the engine back in working order. The day stretched long and uneasy. Emma did her best to keep the geese comfortable, but the sickness wasn't letting up. The birds huddled together, weak and silent. The only sound was the occasional shuffle of feathers against the straw. Then, just past noon, the vet called. Emma pressed the phone to her ear, heart pounding. Emma, Dr. Fisher said, his voice grave. We've got a problem. She gripped the kitchen counter. What is it? We received more reports this morning. Other farms in the area. Their birds are getting sick too. And not just birds. Emma's stomach dropped. What do you mean? The vet hesitated. A goat, piglet, even a dog. Whatever this is, it's spreading beyond poultry. Emma's knuckles turned white against the phone. Are you sure? Yes. And I need to know. Have any of your other animals shown symptoms? She turned slowly, looking out the window toward the barn. The cows were grazing as usual. The pigs snuffled in the mud. The rabbits twitched their noses. Everything seemed normal. But for how long? Not yet, she whispered. Watch them closely, Dr. Fisher warned. And if anything changes, call me immediately. Emma barely managed a response before hanging up. Her hands trembled as she braced against the counter. If the sickness spread to the other animals, if they lost the pigs, the cows, the rabbits, she shook her head. No, they wouldn't let it come to that. But as she stepped outside, her eyes flickered toward the coop. The door creaked in the wind. The space beneath it was shadowed, dark and still. Prickle ran down her spine. Something was watching. John had just tightened the last bolt when he heard it. A deep, resonant thud from the barn. He froze, hands still on the engine. Another thud followed, then a splintering crack. Something was inside. He grabbed the nearest tool, a heavy wrench, and marched toward the barn, every step measured. The door groaned as he pushed it open. The scent of hay and earth filled the space, but there was something else beneath it, something sharp, almost metallic. His eyes scanned the stalls. The cows shifted uneasily, their ears twitching. The pigs were pressed to one side of their pen, silent. Even the rabbits, usually oblivious, sat rigid in their hutch. John stepped further inside. Who's there? Silence. Then, from the far corner, where the feed was stored, came a sudden violent crash. The feed bins tumbled over, spilling grain across the floor. A wooden crate split open with a splintering snap. John's grip tightened on the wrench. A shadow shifted in the dim light. Something was here, and it wasn't just the sickness he had to worry about anymore. Chapter 6. The Last Chance to Save the Geese. The night air was thick with damp earth and the distant scent of pine. The farm had grown eerily quiet, the usual evening sounds. Clucking hens, rustling leaves, the occasional lowing of cows. Muted, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Inside the kitchen, John and Emma stood over the wooden table, a steaming pot between them. The herbal concoction simmered, filling the room with an odd, bittersweet aroma. Emma stirred it carefully, her lined face tense with worry. "This is it," she murmured. "Either it works, or we lose them all." John rubbed the back of his neck, watching the thick liquid bubble. The old family recipe had saved birds before, or so Emma's grandmother had claimed. A mixture of boiled nettles, garlic, and other bitter herbs. It was meant to cleanse the body, to drive out sickness from within. Emma ladled the steaming mixture into a bowl and handed it to John. He took it carefully, feeling the warmth seep through the ceramic. "You ready?" she asked. He gave a small nod. "Let's do this." The geese were huddled in the corner of the enclosure, their feathers dull and ruffled. Some barely moved when John and Emma approached. The weakest of them, Snowcap, a bird they had raised from a hatchling, lay motionless, his breath shallow. Emma knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she lifted his head. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. "You have to drink." John held the bowl steady, while Emma carefully dribbled the liquid into the bird's beak. First, nothing happened. The goose didn't even react. But then, slowly, its throat moved, swallowing the bitter mixture. A flicker of hope sparked in Emma's chest. They moved from bird to bird, coaxing each one to drink. Some resisted weakly. Others were too far gone to even respond. But they kept going, determined not to lose another. By the time they finished, exhaustion weighed heavy on their shoulders. John exhaled. "Now we wait." Emma touched Snowcap's wing. "Please," she murmured. "Hold on." That night, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the old wooden shutters. The farm felt uneasy, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the lantern's glow. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then she heard it. A noise. Not the usual creaks of the house or the wind against the barn. This was different, low, deliberate, a scraping sound. She sat up, her heart pounding. John stirred beside her. "What is it?" he mumbled. Emma hushed him, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer now. A soft but distinct thump against the side of the house. John was awake in an instant. He swung his legs over the bed, pulling on his boots. "Stay here," he murmured. Emma grabbed his arm. "Be careful." He gave a small nod, then reached for the shotgun they kept by the door, just in case. The farmhouse door creaked as he stepped outside, the lantern in his other hand casting long shadows across the yard. The cold night air prickled his skin, but he barely noticed. His eyes scanned the darkness. Then he saw them, figures, dark, shifting shapes near the poultry enclosure. John's grip on the gun tightened. "Hey!" he called. The figures froze. For a moment, everything was still. Then movement, fast, silent. They disappeared into the night before John could even raise his weapon. He stood there, breath quick, scanning the empty darkness. But whoever or whatever had been there was gone. Morning came with the scent of damp soil and wood smoke. Emma hurried to the geese the moment the sun crested the hills, her breath coming fast with worry. John followed close behind, glancing toward the barn as he walked. The unease from last night still clung to him. But then Emma gasped. He turned sharply, heart hammering. What is it?" She pointed. There, amid the still weakened flock, stood Snowcap. His legs trembled, his feathers ruffled, but he was standing. Emma clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes bright with tears. John let out a slow breath. "Well, I'll be damned." Snowcap took a small, unsteady step forward, then another. Emma knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his wing. The remedy was working, but as relief washed over them, John's gaze flickered back toward the shadowed edges of the farm. The sickness might be fading, but something else was still out there. Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. An Unexpected Discovery. The morning mist clung to the earth, curling around the barn like silent fingers. John pulled his coat tighter as he strode toward the feed storage, his thoughts tangled in a storm of suspicion. Something had been gnawing at him since the sickness began. The geese had been fine, healthy just days before, and then suddenly they started dropping one by one. The symptoms didn't match any disease he had ever seen. The vet had been just as baffled. And then there were the shadows, the figures by the poultry enclosure, the strange sounds at night. John reached the feed shed and hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The smell hit him immediately. Something foul, rotten beneath the usual scent of grain. His gut clenched. Kneeling down, he grabbed a handful of feed from the nearest sack. Felt damp. Wrong. Holding it up to the light, he squinted at the dark patches clinging to the kernels. Mold. His stomach twisted. Emma had been right all along. This wasn't a viral outbreak. It wasn't a natural disease at all. This was poisoning. The vet arrived within the hour. Dr. Fisher stepped out of his truck with his medical bag slung over one shoulder, his face a mixture of curiosity and concern. John wasted no time. He led him straight to the feed shed, thrusting the moldy grain into his hands. Dr. Fisher frowned, rubbing the kernels between his fingers before bringing them close to his nose. He recoiled slightly. "This isn't just regular spoilage," he muttered. "This is mycotoxin poisoning." Emma, who had been listening anxiously from the doorway, stepped closer. "What does that mean?" Dr. Fisher sighed, shaking his head. "It means the feed was contaminated with toxic mold. Birds are incredibly sensitive to it. If they eat enough, their organs start shutting down. It explains everything: the weakness, the rapid decline, even the strange behavior before they collapsed." Emma swallowed hard. "But how did this happen? We store our feed properly, always have." John's jaw tightened. "That's the question, isn't it?" Dr. Fisher ran a hand through his graying hair. "Mold like this doesn't just appear overnight. It takes time, damp conditions, the right temperature." He hesitated. "Or someone tampering with the storage." Emma's breath hitched. "Are you saying someone did this on purpose?" The vet met her gaze. "I can't say for sure, but I can say that this level of contamination isn't natural." John's mind raced. The shadows in the night, the broken feed bins in the barn, the figures he had seen. Somebody had been here. Somebody had done this. Determined to find answers, John drove to the next farm over. Old Bill had lived in these parts longer than anyone, and if there was something strange going on, he would know about it. Bill was sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. His sharp eyes flicked up as John approached. "Been a while," Bill said, his voice as rough as the bark of an old tree. "What brings you round?" John sat on the steps, rubbing his palms together. "Sick geese. Thought it was a virus, but turns out it was mold in the feed." Bill's knife stilled mid-carve. He exhaled through his nose. "Damn shame. Same thing happened back in the day." John's spine stiffened. "When?" Bill set his carving aside. "About 40 years ago. Farms around here lost whole flocks. Some cattle too. Took months to figure out what was causing it." He gave John a pointed look. "Turned out some folks didn't want small farmers doing too well." A chill crept up John's back. "You're saying it was sabotage?" Bill nodded slowly. "Ain't saying it was the same folks, but history has a way of repeating itself." John clenched his fists. This wasn't just bad luck. Someone was targeting their farm, and he had a feeling he already knew where to start looking. That night, John barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every strange moment from the past few weeks. The broken feed bins, the rustling outside the coop, the figures vanishing into the night. And then he remembered the footprints. That morning, before the sickness worsened, he had noticed faint tracks around the poultry enclosure. At the time, he had assumed they belonged to a stray animal. But what if they didn't? What if whoever poisoned the feed had left their mark behind? John threw back the covers and got out of bed. It was time to find out the truth. Chapter 8. Who is behind all this? The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and hay as Emma stepped into the feed shed. She adjusted the scarf around her neck, her breath visible in the cool dawn light. The geese were recovering slowly, but surely. Snowcap, the first to stand, had even managed to waddle around a bit. Yet, something still gnawed at her. She glanced around the shed, her gaze sweeping over the wooden shelves lined with feed bags. And then she frowned. Something was off. She had a habit of keeping things in perfect order, old habits from a lifetime of running a farm. The feed bags should have been stacked neatly, one row against another. But now, they were different. Some were slightly shifted. Others leaned at an odd angle. Her heart quickened. Had John moved them, or was someone else coming here at night? Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for one of the sacks. She pulled it forward, feeling the weight shift in her arms. And then, a small tear near the bottom spilled a handful of grain onto the wooden floor. But that wasn't what made her breath hitch. Nestled in the torn seam of the sack, something dark glinted under the dim light. She crouched down, fingers brushing over the foreign object, and pulled it free. a scrap of plastic, a small, broken vial. Her stomach lurched. "John!" Her voice cracked through the quiet. John rushed into the shed, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What is it?" Emma held up the vial. "I found this inside one of the feed bags." His expression darkened. He took it from her, turning it over in his calloused hands. "This ain't right. It looks like something was in it." Her voice was barely a whisper. John exhaled sharply. Some kind of chemical, maybe? A horrible realization settled between them. Someone hadn't just let the feed rot. Someone had put something in it. Emma's hands curled into fists. Who would do this to us? John's mind raced. And then, like a shadow creeping into the light, a name surfaced. He looked at Emma. "You remember Frank Daly?" Emma's brows knitted together. "The man who tried to buy our land a few years ago?" John gave a slow nod. He wanted to expand his operation. Said small farms like ours were a waste of land. When we refused to sell, he wasn't happy about it. Emma's eyes widened. "You think he did this?" John's jaw clenched. "I think it's about time we found out." That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, John retrieved an old trail camera from the barn. It had been years since he last used it, back when a coyote had been sniffing around the chicken coop. He set it up carefully, positioning it to cover the yard and the shed. The lens reflected the last rays of light as he secured it to the wooden fence. Emma stood beside him, arms wrapped around herself. "Do you really think he'd come back?" John fastened the last strap and turned to her. "If he's the one behind this, he'll come back to finish what he started." She swallowed hard. "And if it's someone else?" John sighed. "Then we're about to find out who." The night was thick with silence. John lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. The faint creak of the house settling, the distant hoot of an owl, the rhythmic breathing of Emma beside him. Then, a noise, soft, almost imperceptible, a shuffle of feet outside. John tensed. He reached for the shotgun beside the bed, moving carefully so as not to wake Emma. Another sound, closer now, a rustling near the shed. Heart pounding, he slipped from the bed, stepping barefoot across the wooden floor. He pushed open the bedroom door, moving through the dark house with careful, practiced steps. The front door groaned as he eased it open. Cold night air hit his face. The yard was bathed in silver moonlight, casting long, twisting shadows. The barn loomed ahead, silent and unmoving. The trees stood still, their branches clawing at the sky. But then, a figure, near the shed. John's breath caught in his throat. They were dressed in dark clothing, hood pulled up, moving with careful precision. Not an animal, not the wind, person. John tightened his grip on the shotgun, his voice low and steady. "Who's there?" The figure froze. For a second, everything was still. Then, they bolted. John swore under his breath and took off after them, his boots pounding against the dirt. The intruder was fast, slipping between the fence posts like a shadow. John pushed harder, closing the distance, but as he reached the edge of the yard, gone, swallowed by the night, he stood there, breath heavy, scanning the darkness. His pulse thundered in his ears. Whoever it was, they knew the land well enough to disappear into it. He turned back toward the house. The shed door was ajar. John stepped inside, his hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline. And then, in the dim moonlight, he saw it, near the scattered feed. The footprint, clear, deep, and beside it, a torn piece of fabric caught on the rough edge of a wooden crate. John knelt, his fingers brushing over it. Dark material, slightly frayed. He exhaled slowly. They had proof now, and whoever had done this had just made their first mistake. Chapter 9. The Final Blow, Salvation and the Truth. The next morning, John sat at the kitchen table, his eyes glued to the small screen of the trail camera. He replayed the footage over and over, his heart pounding in his chest as the figures moved through the yard, their steps careful, deliberate. He watched the shadowy figure approach the feed shed, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. The figure lingered for a moment, as though surveying the area, before slipping into the shadows again. John's blood ran cold. It was exactly as he'd suspected. Someone had been coming here every night. Emma stepped into the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's going on, John?" He turned the screen toward her. Her eyes widened as she watched the footage. "It's him," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "It's Frank Daly." John nodded grimly. "I was right. He's the one behind this. He's been coming here, poisoning our feed, trying to ruin us." Emma's face hardened. "Why would he do this?" "Because we refused to sell him our farm," John replied bitterly. "He's been trying to drive us out of business for years." Later that afternoon, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the farm. Emma was checking on the animals, ensuring the geese were stable and eating properly, while John prepared to confront the person who had nearly destroyed everything they'd worked for. He didn't know how or when Frank had started his campaign of sabotage, but he was certain that now was the time to get answers. It was in the barn where everything would come to light. John had received word that Frank had been spotted nearby, and he knew this confrontation couldn't wait. He found Emma, just as she was stepping into the barn with a bucket of water. She looked up at him, concern furrowing her brow. "John, something doesn't feel right," she said, her voice low. Before he could ask what she meant, the door creaked open behind them. A tall figure stepped into the barn, Frank Daly. His face was a twisted mask of irritation and something else that John couldn't quite place. Well, Frank's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. "Looks like you figured it out." Emma stepped back, placing the bucket down. "Why, Frank? Why would you do this to us?" Her voice was almost pleading, but Frank wasn't about to show any remorse. He crossed his arms, a smirk on his face. "You two were always so stubborn. I thought I could run you out of here, get you to sell me the farm, but you refused. And now look where you are." John clenched his fists. "You've been poisoning our feed, Frank. You've been trying to destroy us." Frank's smirk widened. "I didn't think you were so blind. All I had to do was nudge things a little. Poison the feed. Let the animals get sick. I thought it might be enough to push you out." Emma's eyes filled with fury. "You bastard." John stepped forward, his jaw tight. "You're going to pay for this." Frank chuckled. "I don't think so. You can't prove anything." But just as he finished speaking, a voice called out from the doorway. "Dr. Fisher, their veterinarian. I think I can prove it." Frank turned, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the vet. "What's this?" "Your little guard dog." Dr. Fisher stepped into the barn, holding up a small bag of evidence. "We've tested the feed. There are traces of chemicals that didn't come from mold." Frank's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You can't prove anything. I have my rights." "You've already admitted it," John growled. "And we've got proof now. It's over." With Frank's confession, things began to unravel quickly. The local authorities were called in, and the investigation into the sabotage was underway. Frank was arrested, and John and Emma were left to deal with the aftermath. But there was one thing they knew for certain: their farm, their livelihood, was safe. The geese were recovering. The sick birds, thanks to Emma's persistence and the old family remedy, had been saved. Dr. Fisher had confirmed it. The herbal concoction had worked where modern medicine failed. The geese had been poisoned, but the traditional treatment had given them a fighting chance. "We were lucky," Dr. Fisher said, smiling as he watched the geese waddle about. "It's rare that something like this works, but it did. You saved them." Emma beamed. "It was the only thing we could do." But as John watched the geese, a thought crossed his mind. The tractor. It had been a constant frustration lately, its engine sputtering and stalling at the worst possible times. He had put off fixing it, but now, with the farm back on track and Frank out of the picture, there was no more avoiding it. That afternoon, John took a deep breath and walked to the barn, where the old tractor sat, its engine silent. He removed the hood, looking over the rusted parts, his mind already preparing for the task ahead. The more he worked on it, the clearer it became that this was going to be a bigger job than he had anticipated. But there was no turning back now. As John began taking the tractor apart piece by piece, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he and Emma could face them together. The farm was their life, and no matter what happened, they would continue to fight for it, and no one would ever take that away from them. Chapter 10. A kind ending and a new dawn. The sun had barely risen, casting a warm golden light over the farm. Emma stood by the geese pen, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. One by one, the geese waddled around, their movements slow but steady, and for the first time in weeks, Emma could finally breathe without the weight of worry pressing on her chest. The birds had recovered. "Look at them, John," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They're better. They're going to be okay." John stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He had been there through every moment, every difficult decision, and now, after all their hard work, it felt like everything was coming together. "I knew they could make it," he said softly, a proud smile tugging at his lips. "You never gave up on them, Emma. That's why they're here today." Emma wiped a tear from her cheek, not caring that it mixed with the dust of the farm. "I never would have given up," she said, her voice shaking with the relief she felt deep in her soul. "They're family." John nodded. "And family doesn't give up on each other." Later that afternoon, after a long day of working around the farm, John stood in front of the old tractor. He had been putting off the repair for weeks, but today, something had shifted in him. Maybe it was the healing of the geese, or maybe it was the fact that for the first time in a while, things were finally looking up. He rolled up his sleeves, determined to finish what he had started. It wasn't easy. The tractor had seen better days, and fixing it had become an almost mythical task in his mind. But he refused to back down. With every part he fixed, with every adjustment he made, the tractor began to purr back to life. Finally, with a satisfying turn of the key, the engine rumbled to life. John stood there for a moment, stunned by the sound. It was the same sound he had heard when he first brought the machine to their farm all those years ago. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. "She's as good as new," John muttered with a satisfied grin. "Well, as good as she's ever going to get." From the porch, Emma watched him, her hands resting on the railing, a smile slowly spreading across her face. "You did it," she called out. "I knew you could." "Of course," John replied, wiping his brow. "Now we can finally get back to work." The next few days were a blur of activity. With the tractor running smoothly, the animals flourishing, and the farm starting to look more like the place it had been before the storm, life slowly returned to its rhythm. The police had found Frank Daly, and though they had enough evidence to prosecute him, John and Emma had made a choice. They didn't want to drag out the drama any longer. Instead of seeking revenge, they had chosen to forgive. Frank had made his decision, and now it was time for them to move on, leaving the past behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, the familiar sounds of the farm returned. The cows lowed softly in the distance, the pigs snorted in their pens, and the geese called to each other across the field. The gentle hum of the barn's ventilation fan was a soothing reminder of the quiet life they had fought so hard to protect. John and Emma sat on the porch, holding hands in the fading light. "I'm proud of us," Emma said, her voice full of gratitude. "We've been through so much, and we're still standing." John squeezed her hand, his eyes soft with affection. "We're stronger than we think." The next morning dawned crisp and clear. John and Emma stood together, looking out at the farm, the promise of a new day unfolding before them. The past was behind them, and all that mattered now was the future. They had faced the darkest of storms, both in the world around them and in their hearts. And now, they knew that no matter what challenges might come their way, they would face them together. The farm was theirs. It had always been theirs, and nothing at all could take that away. With the first light of day pouring over the fields, John and Emma shared a quiet moment, their hearts full. "Here's to a new beginning," Emma whispered, her voice filled with hope. John smiled, looking at the horizon, the soft glow of morning casting a warm light over everything. "A new beginning," he repeated, his voice steady. And no matter what happens, we'll face it together. And so, as the animals roamed the farm, and the sun rose on a new day, John and Emma knew that, despite all the hardships they had faced, they had found something more valuable than anything else, each other. And that was enough.